The rain began as a light drizzle, turning the vibrant colors of the market into a blurred watercolor of gray and neon. But Haru didn't budge. Water dripped from her box braids, making the colorful beads click softly together like a countdown. She stood in the center of the narrow alley, her stained pink dress clinging to her frame, but her posture was as unyielding as the skyscrapers Jinhwan owned. She raised a small, trembling finger and jabbed it toward the center of Jinhwan's impeccably tailored chest. "My mom can't read your fancy signs," she shouted, her voice cutting through the rhythmic patter of the rain and the hushed whispers of the crowd. "But she can read a bully from a mile away. And you're just a big bully with a fast car." Jinhwan froze. In the underworld, men lost their lives for less than a finger pointed at his heart. His bodyguards, two hulking shadows in black silk, took a half step forward, their hands twitching toward their jackets. The air turned electric, the kind of tension that precedes a lightning strike. The market vendors held their breath. Even the sound of the rain seemed to mute in anticipation of the dragon's wrath. Jinhwan looked down. He didn't look at the crowd or the shivering woman behind the vegetable cart. He looked at the girl. He traced the line of her defiant arm up to her face, where her crooked, lensless glasses were fogging up from her heat. He saw the smudge of dirt on her cheek and the fierce, protective fire in her eyes, a fire he hadn't seen in anyone since he was a boy begging for scraps in these very same gutters. Slowly, Jinhwan leaned down. The height contrast was staggering, a mountain bowing to a pebble. He didn't yell. He didn't sneer. Instead, he reached out a gloved hand and gently straightened Haru's glasses. The leather of his glove was cold, but his gaze was uncharacteristically focused. "Do you know who I am, little one?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic rumble that vibrated in the humid air. "I know you're the man who made my mom cry," Haru shot back, refusing to blink even as a raindrop ran down her nose. "And in my house, that makes you a nobody." A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or a memory long suppressed, passed over Jinhwan's sharp features. He straightened up, the rain slicking back his dark hair and highlighting the geometric ink on his neck. He didn't apologize, but he didn't strike. He simply signaled to his men to stand down. "Your mother has a very loud shield," Jinhwan said, casting a singular, unreadable glance toward Miyoke, who was clutching her apron in terror. He turned back toward his idling sedan, the engine purring like a caged beast. "I think I'd like to see how long that shield lasts against the real world." As the black door closed with a heavy, expensive thud, Haru stayed exactly where she was, her hands returning to her hips, watching the red taillights disappear into the mist. She had won the battle, but as the market slowly exhaled, the weight of what she had just challenged began to settle over the alley like the coming night. The silence that followed the departure of the black sedan was heavier than the rain. In the middle of the alley, Haru remained a tiny, defiant statue, her chin still tilted upward as if she could still see Jinhwan's cold eyes through the tinted glass. Behind her, Miyoke finally found her breath, rushing forward to pull her daughter into a crushing, trembling embrace. The market vendors began to murmur, a low tide of anxiety washing over the stalls. They had seen the dragon's mercy before, and it usually felt a lot like a death sentence delayed. Inside the car, the atmosphere was pressurized. Jinhwan sat in the back seat, his gloved fingers tracing the sharp crease of his trousers. His lead enforcer, a man whose scars told stories of 100 silent wars, glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir," the man rasped, his hand still hovering near the door handle. "The girl, she was disrespectful. Should I send the boys back to clear the stall? To show them the cost of such a tongue?" Jinhwan didn't answer immediately. He stared out at the blurred neon lights of Seoul, the rain streaking the window like tears on a cold face. He could still feel the phantom pressure of that small, mud-smudged finger against his chest. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in decades, not pain, but a puncture in his armor. "No," Jinhwan said, his voice a low, dangerous velvet. "If you lay a hand on that child, you won't live to see the sunrise." The enforcer stiffened, the air in the car turning ice cold. Jinhwan closed his eyes, but He couldn't escape the image. He saw the way Haru's beaded braids had clicked, the way her lensless glasses sat crooked on her nose, and the absolute, terrifying purity of her rage. Most people looked at him and saw a monster, a king, or a paycheck. That girl had looked at him and seen a bully. As the car glided toward his penthouse, Jinhwan found himself thinking of the name Mioke. It tasted familiar, like a ghost of a flavor from a lifetime he had tried to burn away. He remembered a woman's hands, rough, warm, and smelling of earth, offering a piece of bread to a boy who had been beaten by the world. He looked down at his own hands, encased in expensive leather, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of hollowness. He was the dragon of soul, a man who moved markets and broke lives with a whisper. Yet, as he watched the rain wash over the city, he realized he was suddenly, inexplicably, a captive to the memory of an 8-year-old girl in a stained pink dress. He didn't just want to crush her spirit. He wanted to know where such a small heart found the strength to defy a god. "Find out everything," Jinhwan commanded, his eyes snapping open as the car pulled into his private garage. The stall, the debts, the school. "I want to know why a jade is selling cabbage in the mud." Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this video, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button right down there. It's completely free. It helps the channel grow more than you know, and you'll never miss a video from me again. Also, smash that like button if you're— The following morning, a black envelope was tucked between the crates of radishes and Napa cabbage at Mioke's stall. It wasn't a threat, but in the world of the dragon, a request was in order. Jinhwan had purchased every leaf of produce they possessed, with one non-negotiable condition: it had to be delivered to his private residence by the vendors themselves. The truck Mioke rented groaned under the weight of 500 kilograms of cabbage as they wound their way up the manicured hills of Gangnam. Haru sat in the passenger seat, her chin resting on the dashboard, her beaded braids clicking against the glass as she stared at the iron gates that swung open like the jaws of a silent beast. The penthouse sat atop a spire of glass and steel, a monument to a man who lived above the clouds, far from the smell of earth and salt. When the elevator doors slid open directly into the foyer, the contrast was blinding. The market was a riot of noise and color. Jinhwan's home was a cathedral of white marble and hushed shadows. Every surface was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the mud on Haru's sneakers and the worn, stained hem of Mioke's apron. Jinhwan stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, his back to them, looking out over the city he owned. He didn't turn when the heavy crates were wheeled in. He didn't acknowledge the grunt of effort as Mioke stacked the green heads of cabbage against the pristine white walls of his kitchen. "My kitchen is the finest in the country," Jinhwan said, his voice echoing in the hollow space. "And yet, it has never smelled of anything but cleaning fluid. Today, it smells of the gutter." "It smells like hard work," Haru countered, her voice ringing out unnaturally loud in the sterile room. She marched across the expensive rug, her hands finding her hips. "You bought all this just to make my mom carry it up here? You have a fridge the size of our house, and it's empty. You're not going to eat this, are you?" Jinhwan slowly turned, his sharp features catching the cold morning light. He looked at the mountain of vegetables, enough to feed a village, now cluttering his minimalist sanctuary. He looked at Mioke, who stood with her head bowed, her hands red and raw from the morning's chill. "I bought it because I wanted to see if the jade looked the same in the light of my world as she did in the mud of yours," Jinhwan murmured, his eyes locking onto Mioke's for a fraction of a second too long. The tension in the room was brittle. To Jinhwan, this was a display of power, a way to remind them of the distance between their lives. But as Haru picked up a stray leaf and tossed it into his designer sink, he realized he hadn't brought them into his world to break them. He had brought them there because his world was too quiet, and for the first time in 20 years, he wanted someone to make some noise. While Mioke was busy arranging the last of the crates in the industrial-sized kitchen, Haru wandered. Her curiosity was a compass that always pointed toward trouble, and it led her through a set of towering oak doors into a room that smelled of old paper and expensive leather. It was a library that climbed toward the ceiling, thousands of spines lined up like soldiers in a silent war. Haru stood in the center, her small head tilted back until her glasses nearly slipped off her nose. She reached out, her fingers trailing over the gold-embossed titles of books that cost more than her mother earned in a year. "Those aren't picture books, little one." A cold, smooth voice vibrated from the shadows. Jinhwan was sitting in a high-backed wing chair, a glass of dark liquid in one hand and a heavy leather volume in the other. The light from the fireplace flickered across the geometric tattoo on his neck, making it look like it was breathing. He didn't look up as he spoke, his tone dripping with the kind of polished arrogance that usually made grown men stutter. "Most of the people who visit this room only look at the covers to feel important. I doubt your school has even taught you how to pronounce the titles." Haru didn't flinch. She pulled a thick, green book from the shelf, a collection of classical philosophy, and hugged it to her chest. "My mom says some people buy books to learn, and some buy them because they're lonely and want to hear someone else's thoughts for once," she retorted, her beaded braids clicking as she marched toward him. "You have all these words, but I bet you don't even know what they mean." Jinhwan finally looked up, a sharp, amused glint in his eyes. He set his glass down with a slow, deliberate click. "Is that so? You think a market girl can outread the dragon?" "I don't think." "I know," Haru said, slamming the green book onto the low table between them. "A reading duel.
Right now."
You pick a page, I read it. Then I pick a page and you read it. If I win, you have to stop calling my mom names. If you win, you can keep being a bully." Jinhwan felt a rare, genuine spark of intrigue. He opened his own book to a dense, complex passage on political theory and slid it toward her. Haru squinted through her glasses, her lips moving silently for a second before she began. Her voice was steady, rhythmic, and shockingly clear. She didn't stumble over the archaic vocabulary. She treated the words like the vegetables in her mother's stall, with respect and familiarity. When she finished, the room was so quiet they could hear the embers pop in the grate. She slid the book back to him, her chin jutted out in that familiar, defiant pose. Jinhwan looked at the page, then at the girl. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just dealing with a brave child. He was dealing with a mind that had been sharpened by a mother who had sacrificed everything to ensure her daughter would never be illiterate, even if the world refused to see it. The library was a labyrinth of secrets, and Haru was its most dangerous explorer. While Jinhwan was pulled away by a low-voiced subordinate to discuss a territory dispute in the foyer, Haru didn't return to her mother in the kitchen. Instead, she drifted toward the massive mahogany desk that anchored the room, a fortress of polished wood that smelled of expensive tobacco and old ink. She knew she shouldn't be there. She knew the men in the black suits were just outside the door. But Haru had always been a girl who preferred the truth to safety. Her small fingers brushed against a shallow drawer that wasn't quite shut. Inside, there were no gold bars or silver pistols. There was only a single, weathered envelope, its edges frayed as if it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. Haru pulled it out, her beaded braids clicking softly in the silence. Inside was a photograph, cracked and yellowed at the corners, clearly salvaged from a life long forgotten. Haru's breath hitched. The woman in the photo was young, hardly more than a girl herself, with a smudge of flour on her cheek and a smile that reached her eyes. She was standing in the very same market where Haru spent her afternoons, her hands resting on a wooden crate of radishes. She looked vibrant, untroubled, and hauntingly familiar. "Mama?" Haru whispered, her glasses slipping down her nose. It wasn't the Miyoke she knew now, the woman with the tired eyes and the back that ached from heavy lifting. This was a beautiful jade before the world had tried to polish her away. In the corner of the frame, a small, blurred hand reached out to touch the woman's apron, a boy's hand, thin and trembling. "You have a very bad habit of touching things that don't belong to you." A voice like sliding ice cut through the room.
Haru didn't jump.
She slowly turned, the photograph still clutched in her hand. Jinhwan stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking the light from the hallway. His face was a mask of cold fury, the geometric tattoo on his neck darkening as his pulse quickened. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Give it back," he commanded, his voice trembling with a rare, raw emotion that wasn't quite anger. "She was beautiful," Haru said, holding the photo out but not letting go. She looked up at the man who called her mother ugly and illiterate. "She looks like she's giving someone a present. Why do you have a picture of my mom from before I was born?" Jin Huan snatched the photo away, his fingers brushing against hers for a fleeting, electric second. He stared at the image, his jaw tight enough to crack. For a moment, the dragon of soul disappeared, replaced by the ghost of a starving boy who had once been saved by a girl's kindness. "She wasn't always a market vendor," Jin Huan murmured, his voice so low Haru had to lean in to hear. He tucked the photo into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "And you are far too much like her for your own good." The market was just beginning its evening hum, the string lights overhead casting a warm, amber glow over the rows of stacked produce. Mio-Kei was humming a quiet melody, her hands moving with practiced grace as she polished a pile of apples, unaware that the air had suddenly grown thin. The usual cacophony of the stalls, the rhythmic thud of cleavers and the high-pitched haggling, was cut short by the screech of tires. 3 nondescript vans swerved into the narrow alley, shattering the peaceful twilight. Men in gray jackets, looking nothing like genuine's polished enforcers, spilled out like a dark stain. They didn't come to talk, they came to destroy the one thing Jin Huan had started to value. "Clear it out," a voice barked, and the chaos began. Stalls were overturned, crates of precious jade, vegetables were kicked into the mud, and the sound of breaking glass echoed against the brick walls. "Haru, get under the counter," Mio-Kei screamed, her voice cracking with a maternal instinct that overrode her terror. She didn't hide. As a heavy-set man raised a lead pipe to strike the elderly woman at the flower stall next to theirs, Mio-Kei threw herself forward. She was a shield of flesh and bone, her apron fluttering as she shoved the grandmother out of the way. The blow intended for the flowers caught Mio-Kei across the shoulder and ribs. She collapsed into the damp earth, a sharp cry escaping her lips as she landed amidst the scattered remains of her hard work. Haru, watching from the shadows of the stall, felt the world go silent. The colorful beads in her braids didn't click. They seemed to freeze as she watched her mother, the most beautiful queen in Seoul, crumple into the dirt. The raiders were systematic, smashing lanterns and spraying fuel, their eyes searching for the dragon's signature. They wanted a reaction from Jin Huan, and they were willing to bleed the market dry to get it. But they hadn't accounted for the small girl with the crooked glasses who was now crawling toward her fallen mother. Mio-Kei groaned, her face pale against the wet pavement, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Even through the pain, her hand reached out, blindly searching for her daughter. "Haru, run,"
she wheezed.
But Haru didn't run. She knelt in the mud, her pink dress soaking up the filth of the market floor, and pulled her mother's head into her lap. She looked up at the men destroying their world, her eyes no longer just defiant. They were cold. In that moment, she looked exactly like the man with the neck tattoo. The market was a battlefield of broken glass and spilled blood, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Haru knew the time for manners was over. The dragon was coming, and he was going to find a fire he didn't start. The sterile white hallway of the municipal hospital smelled of ozone and industrial soap, a scent that made Haru's stomach churn. She sat on a plastic chair that was far too big for her, her legs dangling, her pink dress now a mosaic of dried mud and her mother's blood. Mio-Kei was behind the double doors of the trauma ward, and the silence of the waiting room was a suffocating blanket. Then, the heavy doors at the end of the corridor hissed open. Jin Huan moved through the hospital like a dark tide. He was flanked by 6 men in suits, their footsteps a rhythmic, military thud that echoed off the linoleum. He looked out of place, a predator in a house of healing. His jaw was a jagged line of granite, and the tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with a low, dangerous heat. He didn't look at the nurses who scattered out of his path. His eyes were fixed solely on the small girl sitting alone. As he reached the ward doors, Haru didn't cower. She slid off the chair, her beaded braids clicking with a sharp, metallic finality as she planted her feet. She stood directly in front of the entrance, her hands finding her hips in that familiar, defiant pose.
Stop, she said.
Her voice wasn't loud, but it was weighted with a coldness that froze the men in their tracks. Jin Hwan stopped 3 paces away, his shadow stretching over her. Haru, let me through. I've brought the best surgeons in the city. She will be moved to a private suite. No, Haru shot back, her glasses glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. You don't get to touch her. You don't even get to look at her. I am the reason she will survive this, Jin Hwan murmured, his voice a low, desperate rumble. You are the reason she's bleeding. Haru's shout finally broke the silence, her eyes filling with a rage that was far older than 8 years. My mom was fine in her market. She was safe in the mud. Then you came with your fancy cars and your dragon names, and you brought the fire with you. You called her ugly. You called her illiterate. But you're the one who can't see the truth. Your world is a poison, Jin Hwan. And I won't let it kill her. Jin Hwan reached out a hand, a rare gesture of comfort, but Haru flinched back as if his touch were a brand. He pulled his hand back, his fingers curling into a fist. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and saw the reflection of every sin he had ever committed. She was the only person in the world who had the power to make the most feared man in Seoul feel small. Stay back, Haru whispered, her chin trembling but her gaze never wavering. Go back to your glass tower and your empty library. We don't want your help. We just want you to go away. Jin Hwan stood there for a long time, a king barred from his own mercy. For the first time in his life, power wasn't enough. He slowly turned, signaling his men to retreat to the elevators. He would save Mioke from the shadows, but he knew that as long as he was the dragon, he would always be the villain in Haru's story. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying this video, do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button right down there. It's completely free. It helps the channel grow more than you know, and you'll never miss a video from me again. Also, smash that like button if the smell of the hospital, sharp, cold, and metallic, faded into the scent of rain-slicked asphalt and cheap, steaming yeast. 20 years ago, the market had been a different kind of monster, and Jin Hwan had been its smallest prey. He remembered the feeling of his ribs pressing against his skin like cage bars, his feet wrapped in scavenged rags as he shivered behind a stack of empty crates. He was a shadow, a ghost of a boy that the world had collectively decided to stop seeing. He had watched her from the darkness of the alley. She was young then, her skin glowing with a health he couldn't imagine, her hair tied back with a simple, bright ribbon. Mioke. She was the daughter of a vendor, a girl who had a name and a place in the light. In her hand, she held a single, warm steamed bun, the white dough yielding to the touch. It was her lunch, her only meal for a long day of hauling crates. Jin Hwan had stepped into the light, not out of bravery, but out of a hunger so hollow it felt like a physical wound. He expected a shout. He expected the back of a hand or a call for the police. Instead, the girl had stopped. She looked at his trembling hands, his hollowed-out eyes, and the way he tried to make himself small. Without a word, she didn't just offer a piece. She pressed the entire bun into his palms. Her fingers were warm, smelling of flour and kindness. Eat, she had whispered, her voice a soft bell in the chaotic market. You look like you're fading away, little dragon. She had smiled then, a smile that was the first thing Jin Hwan had ever truly owned. She didn't know his name, and he didn't know hers, but for 1 minute in a cold world, she had looked at a monster and seen a boy. She had sacrificed her own hunger, so he could have it tomorrow. In the dimly lit hospital corridor, the memory hit Jin Hwan with the force of a physical blow. He reached into his breast pocket, his fingers trembling as he touched the edge of the tattered photograph Haru had found. He finally understood why he had been so angry in the market. It wasn't because Mioke was ugly or illiterate. It was because seeing her so broken, so worn by the world he had helped create, was a mirror he couldn't bear to look into. The beautiful Jade hadn't lost her value. She had spent it all on him, 20 years ago, and then on the daughter who now stood as his judge. He looked at his gloved hands, the hands that commanded an empire of fear, and realized they were still the same trembling hands of that starving boy. He didn't just owe her an apology. He owed her his life. The glass towers of Gangnam felt like a tomb, cold and silent, reflecting a man Jinhwan no longer recognized. He left the marble floors and the silk sheets behind, trading them for a cramped, drafty apartment situated directly above the vegetable stall. The walls smelled of old wood and the lingering scent of damp earth, and the window overlooked the very alley where his motorcade had once caused such terror. Each morning, before the sun had even managed to burn through the Seoul smog, the dragon was no longer dressed in $10,000 Italian wool. He wore a simple black hoodie, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows of the market as the other vendors began to set up their displays. He didn't sit in his throne. He sat on a wooden crate, a silent, dark sentinel watching over the empty space where Miyoke's beautiful jade stall usually stood. Haru, returning from the hospital with her mother's keys, stopped dead in her tracks when she saw him. She still wore her glasses crooked, her beaded braids clicking with every guarded step. She looked at the man who had once called her mother illiterate, now sitting in the mud of her world. "You're still here," she said, her voice small but still edged with a razor-sharp suspicion. "I am," Jinhwan replied, his voice a low, rough rumble. He didn't look at her. He kept his gaze on the entrance of the alley, watching a group of suspicious men in gray jackets who had been lingering at the corner. They saw him, recognized the geometric tattoo on his neck, and vanished into the mist like smoke. "My mom is coming home tomorrow," Haru said, stepping closer, her hands finding her hips. "The doctors say she has to rest. She can't lift the crates. She can't even stand for long." Jinhwan finally looked at her. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a weary, ironclad resolve. "She won't have to lift a single leaf," he promised. "I will be the one to carry the weight. I will be the one to face the wind." For the first time, Haru didn't shout. She looked at the bruises on his knuckles, not from a fight for power, but from a night spent clearing the charred remains of the market fire. She saw the way he guarded the stall, as if it were the most precious vault in the country. "You're a very strange bully," she whispered, her lip trembling just a fraction. "I'm a man paying a debt that's 20 years overdue," Jinhwan murmured. He reached out, and this time, when he straightened her glasses, Haru didn't flinch. The dragon had traded his wings for a post in the mud, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he was finally standing on solid ground. The rain returned to the market, not as a drizzle, but as a heavy, industrial downpour that turned the asphalt into a mirror of neon and shadow. 3 black sedans, identical to the ones Jinhwan used to command, glided into the alley with a predatory grace. They didn't stop at the entrance. They drove straight to the beautiful jade stall, where Jinhwan was currently stacking crates of radishes, his hands stained with the damp earth he once looked down upon. The back doors opened simultaneously. For men, the syndicate elders stepped out under large black umbrellas held by silent enforcers. They were men of silk and ivory, their faces etched with the cold calculations of a lifetime of crime. The eldest, a man with hair like spun silver, looked at Jinhwan's mud-flecked hoodie and the small, defiant girl standing beside him. "You've become a ghost, Jinhwan," the elder spoke, his voice thin and sharp like a wire. "The dragon does not sleep in the mud. He does not play house with market peasants and children who don't know their place. You are a distraction to the business. The board has decided. Clear the clutter. Burn this alley, return to the tower, and we will forget this lapse in judgment." Jinhwan didn't look up immediately. He finished placing a crate, his movements slow and deliberate. Beside him, Haru gripped the hem of her pink dress, her beaded braids clicking as she trembled, not from fear, but from the raw, concentrated heat of her anger. She looked at the silver-haired man, her glasses spotted with rain, and opened her mouth to shout. Jinhwan's hand, rough and warm, rested on her shoulder. It was a silent command to wait. He finally stood, his tall frame uncoiling like a spring. The height contrast between him and the elders was a physical manifestation of a changing era. He looked at the men who had raised him in a world of blood and jade, and then he looked down at Haru. "You call them clutter," Jinhwan said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that seemed to silence the rain itself. "But they are the only things in this city that are real. You offer me a throne built on shadows. I choose the mud." "You would burn your empire for a market vendor and a child?" the elder hissed, his eyes narrowing. "I would burn the world to keep them safe," Jinhwan replied. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy, gold-crested signet ring, the key to the syndicate's accounts and its loyalty. Without a second thought, he tossed it into the gutter, where it vanished into the dark, rushing water. "The dragon is dead. I'm just a man protecting his family. If you want this market, you'll have to go through me. And I promise you, I'm much more dangerous with nothing left to lose." The elders stared at the empty gutter, then at the man who had just abdicated a kingdom for a vegetable stall. They saw the fire in Haru's eyes and the iron in Jinwon's soul, and for the first time in 50 years, the syndicate felt a chill. They retreated into their cars, the black doors closing with a final, heavy thud. As the taillights faded, Haru reached out and took Jinwon's hand. For the first time, the dragon didn't look away. The morning sun broke over the Seoul skyline, not with the harsh glare of a neon sign, but with a soft, honey-colored warmth that turned the steam from the market kettles into shimmering gold. The black sedans were gone, replaced by a humble delivery van with a new logo, a jade-green dragon curling protectively around a single, bright sun. At the heart of the market, where the beautiful jade stall once stood alone, a new structure had risen. It wasn't a glass tower or a sterile mansion, but a wide, open-air pavilion built of warm cedar and filled with the scent of fresh paper. Above the door, a sign hung in bold, elegant Hangul, the Haru Literacy and Community Center. Jinhwan stood on the threshold, no longer wearing the shroud of a criminal kingpin. He wore a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoo on his neck, a mark that no longer signaled death, but a history he had finally reconciled. He watched as the neighborhood children, their backpacks bouncing, ran into the center where Miyoke sat at a large oak table. She looked radiant, the tiredness in her eyes replaced by a quiet, scholarly focus as she helped an elderly vendor trace the letters of his own name. Haru marched up to Jinhwan, her pink dress clean and her beaded braids clicking rhythmically in the morning breeze. She adjusted her glasses, which were no longer lensless, but held the clear, sharp glass Jinhwan had insisted on. She looked up at him, her hands finding her hips. "The tea is getting cold, and the grandmother from the flower stall says your handwriting is still too messy for the advanced class." Jinhwan let out a low, rare chuckle that rumbled through the market air. He knelt down, bringing himself to Haru's level, a gesture that had once been a condescension but was now a habit of respect. "I'm a slow learner, Haru," he murmured, his voice thick with a genuine, grounded warmth. "But I have a very strict teacher." He turned his gaze toward Miyoke. She looked up from her books and caught his eye, offering a small, knowing nod. In that silent exchange, the insult from that first rainy afternoon was finally washed away. Jinhwan hadn't just given them a building, he had given the market back its voice, and in doing so, he had found his own. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tattered photograph, now encased in a protective frame. He set it on the center's mantelpiece, right next to a fresh jar of Haru's favorite colorful beads. The Dragon of Soul was a ghost of the past. In his place stood a man who finally understood that true power wasn't found in the height of a tower, but in the depth of a promise kept. "Come on, Uncle Jinhwan," Haru said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the light of the classroom. "Class is starting." As they walked inside together, the market hummed with the sound of 1,000 stories finally being written down. The beautiful jade had found its setting, and the day had finally begun.